The silk scarf tightened around Amara Osei's throat at exactly 2:47 a.m. And in that moment, she understood three things with perfect clarity. She was going to die in a Seoul hospital room. The woman killing her was wearing Chanel perfume, and nobody was coming to save her. Park Ji-won's face hovered inches above hers, beautiful and terrible in the dim light, her perfectly manicured hands wrapped around the scarf with the precision of someone who'd done this before. "You should have stayed invisible," Ji-won whispered, her voice calm, almost gentle. "That's what maids do. They see nothing, they say nothing, they disappear." Amara's vision blurred at the edges, her lungs screaming for air she couldn't reach. Her fingers clawed weakly at the scarf, at Ji-won's hands, but 3 days of recovery from a brutal beating had left her too weak to fight. The call button dangled uselessly from its cord. Ji-won had ripped it from the wall the moment she'd entered. Through the window, Seoul sparkled with a million lights, a city full of people who would never know a Nigerian woman with albinism had died trying to save a Korean billionaire's mother from the woman he loved. Ji-won leaned closer, her Chanel No. 5 mixing with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. "I poisoned his mother, you know. I did it slowly, carefully. I masterfully made it look like a stroke, and I would have gotten away with it if you hadn't been so clever. But you had to dig, you weirdo. You had to care. You had to make him look at you the way he's supposed to look at me. Who do you think you are, huh?" The jealousy in Ji-won's voice was almost worse than the lack of air. This wasn't just about covering up murder. This was about a woman so desperate to possess Choi Tae-jun that she'd kill anyone who threatened that possession. His mother, his employee, anyone who reminded him what real love looked like. Amara's hand fell to her side. Her eyes began to close, and then she heard it. Footsteps running down the corridor, a voice shouting in Korean, the sound of a door slamming open with enough force to crack the frame. "Get away from her!" The scarf loosened. Air rushed into Amara's lungs in a painful, gasping flood. Through her tears, she saw him, Choi Tae-jun, 40 years old and worth $3 billion, standing in the doorway of her hospital room like an avenging angel, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his perfect hair disheveled, his face twisted with a rage Amara had never seen on any human being. Behind him, hospital security grabbed Ji-won, pulling her away from the bed. She was screaming now, the calm facade shattered. "She's lying! She attacked me! She's obsessed with you! I'm a Park! You can't do this to me!" But Tae-jun wasn't looking at his fiancée. He was at Amara's bedside, his hands gentle on her face, checking her pulse, removing the scarf with shaking fingers. Amara, look at me. You're safe. I'm here. You're safe." His voice broke on the last word, and Amara realized she was crying. Not from the pain in her throat or the terror still flooding her system, but from the expression on his face, like she was something precious, something worth saving, something that mattered. If you're watching this story right now, wondering how a Korean tech billionaire and a Nigerian woman with albinism ended up in this nightmare, you need to understand something. This isn't where their story began. This is where it almost ended. The real story started 3 weeks earlier, with a different woman in a different hospital bed and a perfume bottle that smelled like poison and devotion. Please pay attention. Things like this happen every day in our society. This story needs to go viral, so please share this to the people you love. And do you mind telling us where in the world you're watching from? I love to see how far these stories travel. Subscribe and like the video. Now, let's continue. 3 weeks earlier, Choi Tae-jun had stood in this same hospital wing, holding his mother's hand and trying to remember the last time he told her he loved her. Young-suk lay in the hospital bed like a porcelain doll, her 70-year-old face peaceful in unconsciousness, machines breathing for her, monitors tracking a heart that kept beating even though her brain had shut down. The doctors called it an unexplained neurological event. Tae-jun called it the worst day of his life. The scans show massive neural pathway disruption, Dr. Kim had explained that first day, his voice professionally sympathetic in the way doctors learned in medical school. "We've induced a coma to prevent further damage. Her chances of recovery—" He trailed off, the sentence hanging unfinished, because finishing it would mean admitting that Yang Suk Choi, matriarch of one of Seoul's wealthiest families, might never wake up. Tae-jun had sat by her bedside for 6 hours straight, ignoring the 17 missed calls from his office, the board meeting he was supposed to chair, the merger negotiations that would fall apart without his signature. None of it mattered. His mother, the woman who'd raised him alone after his father's death, who'd built Choi Industries into an empire while still showing up to every school play, who'd never once made him feel like her success was more important than his happiness, was dying, and he didn't know why. Park Ji-won had arrived at hour 7 with coffee and sympathy, her designer dress perfectly chosen for a hospital visit, expensive enough to show respect, dark enough to show concern. She'd wrapped her arms around Tae-jun and whispered all the right things. "She's strong. She'll fight through this. I'm here for you." And because Tae-jun was exhausted and terrified and desperately grateful not to be alone, he'd believed her. They'd been engaged for 8 months. The wedding was scheduled for spring. Ji-won was perfect on paper. Daughter of the Park family, one of Korea's oldest money dynasties, educated at Cambridge, beautiful in a way that made photographers follow her at charity events. His mother had been the only one who'd expressed doubts. "Something about her eyes," Yang Suk had said 2 months ago, the last real conversation they'd had. "They don't match her smile. Promise me you'll wait. Promise me you'll be sure."
He hadn't promised, and now his mother was in a coma, and he'd never have the chance to tell her whether she'd been right or wrong. On day 7, the hospital administrator had suggested hiring a live-in caregiver, someone with medical training who can provide specialized care. "We have a candidate, highly qualified, though her background is unconventional." That's how Amara Osi had walked into his life. She'd entered his mother's hospital room like she owned it, which should have been offensive, but somehow wasn't. 29 years old, Nigerian by birth, American by passport, and marked by albinism in a way that made her impossible not to notice. Her hair was white blonde and natural, cut short and practical. Her skin was pale cream, her eyes a startling gray that seemed to see everything. She wore modest clothes and no makeup, and when she looked at Tae-jun, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man who was scared. "Mr. Choi," she'd said, her English carrying a slight Nigerian accent that softened the consonants. "I'm Amara Osi. I understand you need someone to care for your mother." "You're a nurse?" he'd asked, taking in the medical textbooks visible in her bag, the confident way she had immediately checked Young Suk's vitals without being asked. "I was a medical student, top 5% of my class at University of Unogu. I left to take care of my younger brother. He needed heart surgery, and medical school doesn't pay." She'd said it matter-of-factly, without shame or self-pity. "I've been working as a private caregiver for 2 years. I'm good at what I do. Your mother deserves someone who won't give up on her just because the doctors have." Something in her voice, determination mixed with genuine compassion, had made Tae-jun's decision easy. "You're hired. Start tonight." Ji-won had not been pleased. A Nigerian caregiver? Tae-jun, what will people think? And her appearance, won't it distract from your mother's care?
He'd shut down that conversation with more force than he'd intended. "Her qualifications are excellent. Her appearance is irrelevant. This isn't about appearances, it's about my mother." Ji-won had smiled and apologized and said of course he was right, but her eyes had gone cold in that way his mother had warned him about. And Tae-jun had felt a small chill that he'd immediately dismissed as stress. Amara had moved into the staff quarters of the family estate the next day and begun a routine that would save his mother's life and nearly end her own. She'd talk to Young Suk for hours, reading Nigerian folk tales and Korean poetry, playing everything from K-pop to jazz, describing the weather and the flowers blooming in the estate gardens. She'd kept meticulous notes in a journal, documenting every flutter of an eyelid, every change in heart rate, every sign that Young Suk's brain was still fighting. "She's in there," Amara had told Tae-jun on day 3. "Her responses aren't random. When I read Chinua Achebe, her heart rate stabilizes. When I play Mozart, her blood pressure drops to optimal levels. She's listening. She's aware. We just have to keep reaching her." Tae-jun had started visiting his mother's room every night after that, arriving at 2 a.m. when the house was quiet and finding Amara always awake, always reading, always caring. They'd talk in whispers so as not to disturb young Suk, about medicine and family, about the weight of expectations and the courage it took to sacrifice your dreams for someone you loved. "My brother is 15, Amara had told him one night, her gray eyes distant with memory. "He was born with a congenital heart defect. My parents couldn't afford the surgery. I was 3 years from finishing medical school, 3 years from being able to help him properly. But he didn't have 3 years. So I left. I work, I send money home, and someday, when he's healthy and strong, maybe I'll go back and finish what I started." "That's not fair," Tae-jun had said, meaning it, hating that someone as brilliant as Amara had been forced to choose between her future and her family.
No, she'd agreed, but it's love. Real love isn't fair, it's sacrifice. It's showing up even when it costs you everything. She'd look at young Suk then, her expression soft. Your mother knows that. You can see it in everything about this room. The photos on the walls, the way she kept every drawing you made as a child. She chose you over everything else. That's what real love looks like. And Tae-jun, who'd spent 40 years surrounded by people who loved his money more than they'd ever love him, had felt something crack open in his chest. Ji-won had noticed the late-night conversations. Of course she had. She'd started showing up at the estate more frequently, always with some excuse, bringing Tae-jun dinner, checking on wedding plans, ensuring he wasn't overtaxing himself with stress. But her eyes would track Amara's movements around the house, cold and calculating, and twice Tae-jun had caught her in his mother's room when she shouldn't have been there. "I was just checking on her," Ji-won had said both times, all innocent concern. "I want to help however I can." But there was something off about the way she'd touched the IV line, the way she'd stood too close to the medication cart, the way she'd looked at young Suk with something that wasn't quite sympathy.
Amara had noticed too. She'd started documenting young Suk's responses to different visitors in her journal, and the pattern had been unmistakable. When Tae-jun visited, young Suk's vitals were calm, stable, peaceful. When staff members visited, her responses were neutral. But when Park Ji-won entered the room, young Suk's heart rate would spike from 70 beats per minute to over 100. Her blood pressure would rise. Her breathing would become shallow and rapid. Every single time. The body doesn't lie, Amara had told herself, staring at 2 weeks of data that painted a picture she didn't want to see. But why would young Suk be afraid of her son's fiancée? The answer had come 3 days ago, hidden in a perfume bottle. Amara had been cleaning young Suk's private sitting room, the suite of rooms attached to her hospital space where personal items were kept, when she'd found it. A custom perfume bottle, elegant and expensive, with a small bold label, Eternal Devotion, custom blend for Park Ji-won. It had been tucked behind a stack of books on young Suk's nightstand, and something about its placement, hidden but not quite hidden enough, had triggered Amara's instincts. She'd opened the bottle and inhaled carefully. The scent was beautiful, jasmine and sandalwood, with something else underneath, something sharp and bitter that didn't belong in a perfume. Amara had studied pharmacology as part of her medical training. She knew what plant alkaloids smelled like, and this perfume contained something that shouldn't be anywhere near human skin. She'd taken a sample, called a former classmate who worked in the toxicology lab at Seoul National University, asked for a discreet analysis, no questions asked. The results had come back 48 hours later, and they'd turned Amara's blood to ice. Gelsemium elegans, a rare flowering plant native to Southeast Asia, containing gelsemine alkaloids that were potent neurotoxins. Odorless when properly diluted, tasteless in food or drink, and capable of causing exactly the kind of unexplained neurological collapse that had put young Suk in a coma. The perfume bottle contained trace amounts mixed into the fragrance oil. Not enough to kill immediately, but enough to poison slowly over weeks of exposure, each spray building up in the system until the brain shut down. Someone had given Park Ji-won a bottle of custom perfume laced with poison, and Ji-won had given that perfume to Young-suk as a gift 3 weeks before her collapse. Amara had sat in her room with a toxicology report shaking in her hands, trying to process what this meant. Had Ji-won known the perfume was poisoned, or had someone given it to her, using her as an unwitting weapon? But then Amara had remembered the embezzlement documents she'd found in Young-suk's private office 2 days earlier. Evidence that Ji-won had stolen 2.3 billion won from the Choi Family Foundation. She'd remembered Young-suk's handwritten note dated 2 weeks before her collapse. I must tell Tae-jun about Ji-won before the wedding. No, I could not let her into this family. And suddenly, everything made terrible, perfect sense. Young-suk, the billionaire's mother, had discovered Ji-won's embezzlement. She'd planned to expose her, to stop the wedding, and to protect her son from a woman who was only after his money. So Ji-won had poisoned her, slowly, carefully, making it look like a natural neurological event. And she would have gotten away with it if Amara hadn't been too stubborn to accept the doctor's diagnosis, too observant to miss the fear in Young-suk's vital signs, and too curious to ignore a perfume bottle that smelled wrong. Amara had needed to tell Tae-jun, but she'd also needed more proof, something concrete that would stand up against a Park family lawyer, something that couldn't be dismissed as the paranoid theories of a foreign caregiver who'd read too many detective novels. She'd planned to compile everything: the toxicology report, the embezzlement evidence, the documented fear responses into a file she could present to him safely, privately, in a way that would make him believe her. But unfortunately, she hadn't counted on Ji-won being smart enough to monitor the estate's security system. Amara hadn't realized that every time she'd entered Young-suk's private office, every time she'd photographed documents, every time she'd taken notes in her journal about Ji-won's visits, she'd been watched. The confrontation had happened in the estate gardens on a beautiful spring morning that smelled like cherry blossoms and betrayal.
"I know you took my perfume," Ji-won had said without preamble, her perfect smile nowhere in evidence. "I know you had it tested. I know you found the financial documents. I know exactly what you think you know, Amara." Amara had tried to play dumb. "Ma'am, I don't understand what you're talking about. Don't insult my intelligence, you bleached weirdo." Ji-won had stepped closer, and for the first time, Amara had seen the real woman beneath the society polish, cold, calculating, absolutely devoid of empathy. "Listen to me, loser. That wretched woman, Young-suk, was going to ruin everything. She found the foundation accounts. She was going to tell Tae-jun I'd been stealing from his precious charity, then turn him against me before I could secure my position as his wife. So I did what any smart person would do. I simply removed the obstacle." "You poisoned her," Amara had whispered, the confirmation still shocking even though she'd already known the truth. "No, I solved a problem," Ji-won had corrected, "and now you've become another problem, but you're easier to solve than Young-suk was. You're a Nigerian caregiver with albinism. I'm a Park. I've got Park blood flowing in me. Who exactly do you think Tae-jun will believe? Who do you think anyone will believe? I have proof. You have theories, and if you try to give them to Tae-jun, I'll finish what I started with his mother, except this time I won't be subtle." Ji-won smiled then, bright and terrible. "And just so we're clear, I saw the way he looks at you, those late-night conversations, the way he touches your hand when he thinks no one is watching. That stops now. You're a maid, he's a Choi. You exist to serve, not to steal, so you'll keep your mouth shut about the perfume. You'll stop making him think you're anything more than staff, and you'll stay exactly where you belong. Invisible."
Amara should have run, should have screamed, should have found Tae-jun immediately and damned the consequences. But Ji-won's threats against Young-suk had been too specific, too credible, so she nodded and backed down and hated herself for it, not knowing that Ji-won had already decided backing down wasn't enough. The attack had come that afternoon. Amara had been called to the service area of the estate, something about medical supplies that needed to be moved. She'd gone alone, unsuspecting, and walked straight into an ambush. A man she'd never seen before, hired muscle who didn't ask questions or care about reasons, had beaten her with professional efficiency, head trauma, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and then he dragged her to the service stairs and arranged her body to make it look like she'd fallen.
Staff had found her 20 minutes later. The official story had been immediate and believable. Tragic accident, poor albino girl must have tripped, so unfortunate. Taejun had been at his office when he'd gotten the call. He'd made it to the hospital in 18 minutes, breaking every traffic law in Seoul, his heart in his throat, because the woman who'd cared for his mother, who'd made him laugh for the first time in weeks, who'd somehow become important in a way he didn't quite understand, was fighting for her life. He'd sat by her bedside the same way he'd sat by his mother's, holding her hand and begging her to wake up. And when Ji-won had shown up with flowers and sympathy, he'd been too devastated to notice the calculation in her eyes, too grateful for her support to question why she seemed almost relieved that Amara couldn't speak. But Ji-won had made one critical mistake. She left Amara's medical journal behind.
Taejun had found it on the second night of his vigil, tucked into the drawer of his mother's bedside table, where Amara had been keeping her daily observations. He'd opened it looking for comfort, something that would make him feel close to the woman who'd cared so much about his mother. What he'd found instead had shattered his world. 2 weeks of detailed vital sign documentation showing Yeon-suk's terror response to Park Ji-won, notes about unexplained neurological symptoms that didn't match the official diagnosis, a toxicology report confirming poison in a perfume bottle, photographs of embezzlement evidence, and on the final page, dated the morning of Amara's accident, a single sentence: "If something happens to me, the perfume is the key. She practiced this before. She'll do it again." Taejun had sat in the dark of his mother's room, reading and rereading those words until they burned into his brain. The woman he'd been planning to marry was a murderer. She'd poisoned his mother to hide her crimes and nearly killed Amara to protect her secret. And he'd been too blind, too trusting, too desperate not to be alone to see what was right in front of him. The rage had been overwhelming. He'd wanted to confront Ji-won immediately, to scream accusations, to watch her perfect facade crack under the weight of her guilt. But rage made people stupid, and Taejun hadn't built a $3 billion company by being stupid. So instead, he'd made a plan. He'd called his head of security and had hidden cameras installed in Amara's hospital room. He'd called his private investigator and had the toxicology report verified by 3 independent labs. He'd called his lawyer and had detailed instructions prepared for what would happen when Ji-won made her next move. Because she would make a next move. Amara had seen too much, knew too much, and the moment she woke up and could speak clearly, every secret Ji-won had killed to protect would come spilling out. So Taejun had set a trap. It was simple, elegant, and devastating.
On the afternoon that Amara had finally woken up, disoriented and in pain but alive, Taejun had visited her briefly. "Don't try to remember everything right now," he'd said gently, holding her hand while fighting the urge to tell her everything, to apologize for not protecting her, to promise that justice was coming. "Just rest. You're safe." Then he'd gone to dinner with Ji-won and delivered his bait with perfect casualness. "Good news. Amara woke up today. Dr. Kim says her memory is completely intact. She'll be giving a statement to the police tomorrow about what happened." It was a lie. Amara's memories of the attack were still fragmented, her concussion making everything before the beating fuzzy and uncertain. But Ji-won didn't know that. Ji-won heard statement to police and memory intact and understood that every secret was about to be exposed, every crime revealed, every carefully constructed plan destroyed. She'd excused herself from dinner early. Taejun had watched her leave and immediately pulled out his phone, opening the security camera app that gave him a live feed of Amara's hospital room. He'd waited, and at 2:47 a.m., when Ji-won had entered Amara's room with murder in her eyes and a silk scarf in her hands, he'd been ready. He'd been watching the entire time. He had seen Ji-won lock the door. He had seen her rip the call button from the wall, had seen her wrap the scarf around Amara's throat with the kind of precision that confirmed what Amara had written. She'd practiced this before. And when Amara had whispered, "He knows. Taejun knows everything," Taejun had stopped watching and started running.
The hospital was only 10 minutes from his estate. He'd made it in 6, had burst through the door of Amara's room with security behind him just as Amara's struggles had started to weaken, just as her eyes had started to close, just as Ji-won had been seconds away from winning. Now, with Amara gasping for air in his arms and Ji-won screaming denials while being restrained by security, Tae-jun did the one thing he'd wanted to do since finding that journal.
He destroyed her. I have everything, he said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. The journal documenting my mother's fear of you, the toxicology report proving the perfume was poisoned, the embezzlement evidence my mother found, the security footage of you attacking Amara, all of it, every crime, every lie, every person you tried to murder. Ji-won's face went white. You can't prove. I already did. Tae-jun pulled out his phone and pressed the button. I've been streaming the security feed from this room to every major news network in Seoul for the past 5 minutes. The entire country just watched you try to strangle an innocent woman. They're seeing the toxicology reports now, the embezzlement evidence, the timeline of my mother's poisoning, all of it. You're not getting away with this, Ji-won. You're going to prison, and everyone is going to know exactly what you are. The moment she understood, the moment she realized her perfect clan had become her public destruction, something broke in Ji-won's face. The mask shattered completely, leaving behind only rage and panic and the kind of desperate cruelty that came from someone who'd never been told no in her entire life. You chose her? Ji-won shrieked, jerking against the security guard's grip. You chose a freaking weird-looking albino maid over me? I'm a park. She's nothing. She's a foreign nurse with a skin condition who should be grateful she was even allowed in your house. You were supposed to be mine. I chose truth over poison, Tae-jun said quietly. I chose the woman who sat with my mother every night and read to her in 2 languages. I chose the person who cared enough to investigate when everyone else said there was nothing to investigate. I chose Amara every time over you. The police arrived 3 minutes later. They read Ji-won her rights while she screamed about lawsuits and family connections and how this was all a mistake, how she was being framed, how no jury in Korea would believe a foreign maid over a park. But the security footage was already viral, 10 million views and climbing. And the toxicology reports had been verified by 3 independent labs, and the embezzlement was documented in Young-suk's own handwriting. Park Ji-won was charged with attempted murder of Choi Young-suk, attempted murder of Amara Osi, embezzlement of 2.3 billion won, and conspiracy to commit murder. Her bail was denied. Her family's company stock crashed 30% in the first hour after the news broke. And by morning, the woman who'd thought being a park made her untouchable had become the most hated person in Seoul. But Tae-jun wasn't watching the news. He was sitting next to Amara's hospital bed, her hand in his, waiting for her to stop crying long enough that he could apologize for not protecting her, for not seeing the danger, for letting her get hurt because he'd been too blind to see what his mother had seen months ago. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have known. I should have seen. You couldn't have known, Amara said, her voice raspy from the strangulation attempt, but firm. She was good at lying. That's what made her dangerous. But you believed me when it mattered. You set the trap. You saved me. She squeezed his hand weakly. You saved us both. You saved my mother first, he countered. You refused to give up on her when everyone else, including me, was ready to let her go. You saw the fear in her vital signs. You found the poison. You documented everything, even though you knew it would put you in danger. You're the bravest person I've ever met, Amara Osi.
She smiled at him, tired and bruised but alive, and Tae-jun felt something in his chest that he'd convinced himself he'd never feel. The kind of connection his mother had always told him was worth waiting for. The kind that made everything else in his life feel secondary. Your mother, Amara said suddenly, trying to sit up. I need to check on her. I've been gone 3 days. Who's been reading to her? Who's been documenting her responses? Rest, Tae-jun said gently, easing her back down. My mother is being taken care of, and actually, he paused, almost afraid to hope,
She's showing signs of emerging from the coma. Dr. Kim thinks the poison's effects are finally wearing off. The sensory stimulation you did, the reading, the music, all of it, it kept her brain active enough to fight through the neural damage. You saved her, Amara. You saved her before we even knew she needed saving. Tears filled Amara's gray eyes. She needs to wake up. She needs to know G1 is gone. She needs to know she's safe. She will, Taejun promised. And when she does, the first thing I'm going to tell her is that she was right about everything. About G1, about being careful. My mother was right. I wish I had listened to her. She told me about waiting for the right person. He lifted Amara's hand to his lips, pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. About you. Before Amara could respond, the door opened and Dr. Kim entered with an expression Taejun couldn't read. Mr. Choi, you need to come to your mother's room. Now. They made it to Young Suk's suite in 90 seconds, Taejun half carrying Amara because she'd refused to stay behind. And there, in the hospital bed where she'd lain unconscious for 3 weeks, Young Suk Choi was awake. Her eyes were open, clouded with confusion and medication, but open and aware, and searching the room until they landed on her son's face. Taejun? The word came out as barely a whisper, her vocal cords weak from disuse. But it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard.
Oma. Taejun was at her bedside immediately, tears streaming down his face, holding her hand like he'd never let go. Oma, you're awake. You're back. You're safe. Young Suk's eyes drifted past him to Amara, hovering uncertainly in the doorway, bruised and bandaged and trying not to intrude on their reunion. You, Young Suk rasped. You're the one who read to me. Achebe, Adichie, Nigerian stories. Amara nodded, not trusting her voice. Thank you, Young Suk whispered. I heard everything. Couldn't respond, but I heard. You kept me fighting. You did the fighting, Amara managed. I just gave you reasons to win. Young Suk smiled weakly, then turned back to Taejun. Ji-won? The name came out with visible effort, her face twisting with remembered fear. In custody, Taejun said firmly. She can't hurt you anymore, Oma. She can't hurt anyone. It's over. Relief flooded Young Suk's face. She tried to say something else, but the effort of speaking had exhausted her. Dr. Kim stepped forward to check her vitals, explaining that she'd need extensive rehabilitation, physical therapy, speech therapy, time to heal. But the prognosis was good. With care and patience, she could make a full recovery. Over the next 3 months, Young Suk did exactly that. The poison's effects gradually wore off, her speech returned, her strength rebuilt, and through it all, Amara was there. No longer a hired caregiver, but family. She'd been offered the position of head of medical research at Hansol Hospital, Taejun's company funding her completion of medical school and her brother's heart surgery. But more than that, she'd been accepted into the Choi family in a way that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with the bonds formed in crisis.
Park Ji-won's trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with an 18-year prison sentence. Her family disowned her publicly. The embezzled money was returned to the Choi Foundation, and the woman who'd thought her name and connections made her untouchable spent her days in a cell, her perfect face aging behind bars, her schemes exposed for the world to see. The real ending came on a spring afternoon 6 months after Young Suk's awakening, in the gardens of the Choi estate, where flowers bloomed and the air smelled like hope. Young Suk had insisted on hosting a celebration, officially to mark her full recovery, but everyone knew it was really about something else. The garden was filled with family and friends, with staff who'd worked for the Chois for decades, with people who'd stood by them through the scandal and the trial and the healing. And in the center of it all, Young Suk sat in her favorite chair, stronger now, holding court like the matriarch she'd always been.
She watched Tae-jun and Amara walk through the garden together, their hands intertwined, their connection obvious to anyone with eyes. She saw the way her son looked at Amara, like she was precious, like she was home, like she was everything he'd been too afraid to hope for. She saw the way Amara looked back, with trust and love and the kind of joy that came from knowing you were seen, truly seen, for exactly who you were. When they approached her chair, Young-suk reached out and took both their hands. She couldn't speak as clearly as she once had, but some things didn't need many words. "Family," she said, placing Amara's hand in Tae-jun's with her blessing clear in her eyes. "You are family."
The story of the silent witness who refused to stay silent became legendary in Seoul's hospitals and medical schools. Amara would go on to become one of Korea's leading researchers in neurotoxicology, her work on plant-based poisons saving countless lives. Tae-jun would transform Hanseol Hospital into a leader in patient advocacy, establishing programs to ensure caregivers had the resources to question diagnoses and investigate inconsistencies. And Jang-suk would spend her remaining years telling anyone who'd listen about the brave woman with white hair and gray eyes who'd seen what everyone else missed and had the courage to act on it. But on that spring afternoon in the garden, none of them were thinking about legacies or lessons or the ways their lives would ripple outward to touch others. They were just a family, broken and rebuilt, scarred but healing, choosing each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And in the end, that choice, to love deliberately, to protect fiercely, to show up even when it would be easier to look away, that was everything. What did you learn from this story? Do you agree that it is important to listen to the advice of elders? Share this story to your loved ones because things like this happen daily in our society. Thank you for watching. Don't go anywhere, and I will see you in the next story.